the short answer to the long question is that your narrative I don't necessarily buy into, but thank you for bringing in one important dimension of the bigger picture.
We have a question from Christina Aquino. All things, physical and mental, including body and mind, are objects and therefore can be experienced. The real self or spirit or God or witness consciousness is the experiencer or the knower. If the experience is poverty, how can God experience it when he or she is the source of all things? How can God experience hatred when he or she is all love? How can God experience death when he or she is life? How can God experience sadness when God is all joy? Please explain.
Okay, I'll take that. It comes from a Vedantic perspective, but I'll request the rabbi to chip in afterwards. And basically, this is a question about it's a question of evil in any philosophy, especially in any religion, theistic religion especially. You have to explain why there is suffering when God exists. An all good and all powerful God, why would there be suffering? So I'll give two answers. One straightforward from a dualistic Vedanta perspective, but the answer is pretty straightforward. God doesn't experience poverty, God doesn't experience unhappiness, God doesn't experience sadness. It is we who experience poverty, unhappiness, and sadness. Dualistic, Who, after all, if you look around, who is sad? Who is suffering from poverty and deprivation? Who is experiencing misery? It's human beings. So, sentient beings experience suffering. God does not. So that resolves the problem from a dualistic perspective. But why do sentient beings experience suffering? Multiple answers can be there. From an Indian perspective, the most pervasive answer, most common answer would be karma, causality. We experience suffering because of our past karma. We know this particular theory that in past lives, we have accumulated negative karma and that results in unpleasantness in this present life. We have accumulated good karma and that results in pleasantness. And if you complain that there's too little pleasantness and too much unpleasantness in my life, what does that say about you or your past lives? So that's one answer. That's just one. That's the surface level answer. But this question was not put from that perspective. This question was put from a Advaitic perspective, where it seems paradoxical. After all, from an Advaitic perspective, sentient beings and God are not separate. There is only one reality, that is Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss. And so how could that Brahman, which is presumably limitless and perfect, how could that Brahman experience poverty and sadness and misery and hatred and all of that? Remember, little technicality here. That Brahman, which is one, non-dual, appears as this world of appearances through the mediation of Maya. Maya is that which projects the one as the many. Since it projects the one as the many, it projects in different ways. With Maya, that same Brahman is called God. And yes, that God, which is similar to the God of dualistic religions, in Vedantic terms, Saguna Brahman with attributes, is all powerful, all loving, all good, beyond poverty. That God does not experience poverty or suffering or sadness. But that Maya also projects that same limitless consciousness as so many sentient beings. And those sentient beings, they undergo spiritual evolution until they realize their oneness with the divinity, with the ultimate reality. And as we undergo spiritual evolution, we go through various experiences. A more subtle, little more difficult, but more sort of final kind of answer is this. The difference between the divinity and our present state of experiences is not a real difference. It's a difference between knowledge and ignorance. So in ignorance, we are these sentient beings struggling in a world of strife and suffering. When we realize what we truly are and what this world truly is and what God truly is, we realize one non-dual Brahman. When we realize that, these questions, I won't say they're solved, but they're dissolved. Notice, these questions which we are asking, for those who we consider to be enlightened, they don't have these questions. These questions are on our side. They have presumably found the answers, and they don't seem to be bothered by these questions anymore. So there's a difference between knowledge and ignorance. In ignorance, we seem to be in this world of strife and struggle. When we become enlightened, we realize that we are one with Brahman, and this is a world of appearance, maybe at best a school for spiritual evolution. That would be the Advaitic answer. But it's a deep question. In theology, in different world religions, this is called the problem of evil. With an all-powerful and all-loving and all-good God, why should there be so much suffering in the world? That's the essential form of that question. I'm sure the Rabbi has given a lot of thought to this in his studies and his research.
Not sure it's me who's given a lot of thought. I think world religions, as you just said, have given a lot of thought. So I'm going to start with Christianity, and then I'm going to move to Judaism. And really the question is, at the end of the day, is, like you said, is evil real, or what is the scope of experiencing? In theory, from the Advaita perspective, if God is everything, then God is also the poverty and the pain and the death and everything. Then everything would be included in that everythingness of God. So really the foundation of the question is a dualistic foundation, because the question was posed, if God is good, how can he experience bad? But if God is everything, then he can experience both good and bad without any distinction. So really that was a dualistic question attempting to frame a monistic view of God, maybe not fully successfully. How do other religions deal with this? So, did Jesus suffer on the cross? I don't know if we should do a poll in the room or not, but did Jesus suffer on the cross? If he was God, how could he suffer on the cross? If he didn't suffer on the cross, then what's the point? So this question was a question that Christian theology struggled with in the early centuries. There was a position called docetic. Docetic means it only gave an appearance that he was suffering. It looked as though he was suffering, which fits in with what you said, Swamiji, about the appearance from our perspective. But then there was a counterpush that said, no, for this to really be, Jesus had to really suffer. In other words, if you talk in terms of God coming down here and experiencing humanity, God has to experience humanity to the full. So Christianity has to come up with various answers of how the divine in its fullness can make room for this limitation. And one important notion that appears already in the New Testament from Paul is the notion of kenosis, an emptying out. God empties himself out from that fullness in order to take on that limitation, which of course, if you couple that with an Advaita Vedanta perspective, is really not an issue, because that emptying out itself is part of the divine. And a Jewish answer that would be very similar appeals to the notion of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means divine self-contraction. So God empties himself from the fullness in order to create reality. So the Kabbalistic theory of creation, as propounded by the great Kabbalistic sage, the Ari, a 16th century great Kabbalist from Tzfat, sees the first step in creation as God creating an empty space within which creation happens. And within that, you get the kind of dualism where there's God and there's creation, because prior to that, there was only divinity. But in order for creation to be real, in other words, what Swamiji spoke about, the shift from nirguna to the saguna, from the non-dual to the dual, there's something that isn't appealed to by the force of Maya, but actually by a force of a real happening. So in the same way that kenosis is understood as a real happening in the divine, so tzimtzum is a real happening in reality, where there's room that's made for creation, and within that come the origin of all limitations, evil, etc., suffering, etc. This then plays out, still on Jewish Kabbalistic ground, in the fact that we have different faces of God. So while the absolute God will not suffer, but within the divine figure, is the aspect of the Shekhinah that I referred to earlier, suffers with us. It is the suffering face of God, if you will. It's the creative aspect, but it's also the aspect that comes together with us and joins in our reality and therefore suffers with us. So we can simultaneously speak, in a matter that's analogous to what Swami said, of God being beyond all suffering, beyond all limitation, and at the same time God also undertaking and entering and being with that, and that is what is known as the exile of the Shekhinah and the suffering of the Shekhinah. So the answer is that great religions, as Swamiji says, struggle with that, and they provide I would say, parallel responses.
I'm Srini Gurappu. I came from Texas for this session. I'm the
For this session?
for this session, yes.
Just for this session?
Yes, for this session.
I'm going to Texas at the end of the week.
Yeah. In fact, you should come. I have a nonprofit called Youth Excellence Center, where we do it. And in fact, now I'm going to build on something that you just mentioned, where in the broader world of Hinduism, only 20% are actually engaged in the spiritual quest. Most everybody is either ignorant or just caught up in the mechanics of life. And this problem gets even more acute as we're talking about the third generation, fourth generation. I'm already seeing with the second generation. So never before in the history of humanity, today we are faced with so many battlefields at once. Before it was all mostly about religion or power and this stuff. But here, now we are faced with things like climate change, the technologies, modern technologies like AI and CRISPR, where you're almost creating a parallel universe. And then economic divide. So most youth don't have a positive perspective on the life and the world. And previously, when we were engaged in similar situation, the God provided that safe space. The faith provided the safe space. But today, most equate faith means conflict. Religion means conflict. And sometimes, when you interpret in some of the scriptures like Gita, where when you are faced with this many battlefields, your right call to action is to go fight to restore excellence. So most youth are now being drawn to action from a position of either survival or to restore excellence. So in that, the faith is actually not taking the prominent role. So in this kind of situation, what should we prioritize in the youth on, either to restore economic excellence or restore climate excellence or, humanity versus technology, to this God quest, which seems to be not an agreeable or inclusive kind of a path. And then Swamiji, one of the things is, when we try to interpret, Gita, the Gita actually created the broader Kurukshetra, but at the end of the day, there were no good saviors, right? There was nothing actually left behind for people to actually go enjoy, or at least that's one of the interpretation. So people are like, even if you are calling it out, what is the ultimate outcome? Ultimate outcome, is it only like a collateral damage? There is all destruction, but there is nothing actually left behind. So how do we inspire the youth take a more positive in this world of many battlefields, and how can faith play a bigger role? Thank you very much.
Rabbi, would you take it up first?
You really came just for this session?
Swamiji.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
Huh?
It happens all the time. People come from all the places just to listen to Maharaj.
Yeah.
Maharaj, I understand, but me? If I can reframe your question, it is the tension between activism and spiritual experience. And what do we educate to? And what is the balance between them? And can one exist without the other? By the very framing of this question is implied the answer that they need each other. So here's an interesting observation. The job description of a guru has changed radically over the last 50 years. Gurus used to be non-political, non-activist. They did some charitable work, but they were basically sitting around teaching people how to reach enlightenment, assuming that was the adequate answer. Today, no guru, major guru, is worth his salt if he hasn't built a big hospital, an educational chain, become involved in major issues. The whole profile of guruhood seems to have undergone a major change in the direction of activism. And it's an interesting question that I haven't seen anyone give accounting to why that is. Also interesting to think of the Ramakrishna mission over a course of more than 100 years and how it's evolved in this particular direction based on the foundations that were totally not activist, and how the branches of Ramakrishna have balanced that over time. So There is an obvious answer within the Hindu tradition that you're coming from, which is karma yoga. In other words, we perform karma yoga, and therefore it is a yoga, but it's a yoga that's action-oriented, and that action is for the welfare of others. That's the easy answer. You pose the question from the educational angle. And the educational angle is, how do we offer the youth, as you put it, a balanced perspective between having a spiritual life and motivating their idealism, so it is not just human activism, but it is tempered by the spirituality.